Okay, welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to look at a section in Chapter 1, which is selecting and replacing computer components. So this section deals with mainly if you're doing upgrades or replacing parts on the computer. There's certain things that you need to take in consideration and that you want to remember. So one of the things that we're going to take into consideration is the form factor, and we learned about that earlier, that computers have a form factor they follow, and that goes for the motherboard and the power supply, and which motherboard you have and processor will determine what type of RAM you will take, and what other components that you have on the computer will determine what kind of power supply you should have and how much wattage that power supply should need or have. A power supply should support 25% more wattage than all the other attached components required. So now the computer case, remember, is going to hold the power supply, the motherboard, and memory and other components. So we want to make sure that they all will work together. We want to make sure those components will fit in the computer case. We want to make sure the power supply has enough power or watts to power everything in there. So when you are going to replace the motherboard, and you want to try to use the current RAM and CPU and the video adapter card that you already have, then you're going to want to make sure that any motherboard that you purchase will work with those components. So you'll take the socket and chipset of the motherboard in consideration. You're going to need to make sure it's compatible with the CPU. If you want to use the existing heatsink you have, then you're going to need to make sure that the motherboard that you purchase will work with that sink fan. And is there enough power on the existing power supply, enough watts, so that that power supply can be used with the upgraded motherboard? And you might upgrade for a couple reasons. It might be because the motherboard burned out, and that happens. It could be that you want to do some upgrades in the computer, but you want to try to use other devices that are in that computer, like the drives, the optical drive, hard drive. You might want to use your existing video card and sound cards if they were upgrade cards, so you added additional PCI or PCI Express cards. And you're going to need to make sure that the motherboard that you have has the slots if you're going to try to use those existing adapter cards. And then something that sometimes can be forgotten because it's common sense, you want to make sure that the motherboard will actually fit into the current case. CPU. Sometimes our CPU will fail and we will need to replace that. We will need to make sure that the CPU will fit into the socket type or slot type and chipset. You need to make sure the BIOS will support this CPU. You'll need to check and see if the CPU you're going to upgrade with will work with the heatsink that you had before, or do you need to buy a heatsink and CPU together? And if you're going to do that, you're going to need to make sure that that heatsink and fan assembly will work with the motherboard that you have. Make sure that you have enough voltage to use the CPU. So there's a lot of things that you need to take in consideration. The best place is to go to manufacturers' websites and check the compatibility. Go on to forums and bulletin boards and see if other people have upgraded this computer and what they've done. As I've mentioned before, Sometimes our computers are disposable, or they're made to be disposable. If your computer is several years old, it might not make sense to do these upgrades. It might be wiser to go out and purchase a new computer, especially if you have an older computer and you go ahead and do the RAM upgrades, and then all of a sudden you need to do a video card upgrade, and then you need to do some other upgrade. In the long term, it might not make sense. Here are some things to take into consideration with our CPU features and the classification. A multi-core processor, the RAM is shared between the processors. There's different types of cache memory. You have L1, L2, and L3. You should be familiar with these. You will need to take in consideration the speed of the processor and the maximum speed without errors. Your front side bus, the path between the CPU and the chipset, and the expansion cards in the RAM, and whether it is 32-bit or 64-bit. That means the number of instructions handled by the processor at one time. Our operating systems today are either 32-bit or 64-bit, and that means they can do certain things, and we want to make sure that if we have a 32-bit only CPU, then we're going to need an operating system that is 32-bit also. Our heatsink and our fan case fans. So you're going to need to take consideration the socket type, the motherboard and physical specifications, the case size, and the physical environment for the type of heatsink fan assembly that you might want to purchase. For a case fan, case size, fan speed, number of components, physical environment, number of mounting places available, location, and the electrical connections. Do you have the connections for it? Again, you would go to the manufacturer's website, check things out. You're going to make sure the form factor is correct. Go onto these boards and see if other people have done a similar upgrade and did it fit. Just because the manufacturer, the third-party vendor of a graphics card says it will fit in your computer, there could be limitations. And reading other people's posts will be a great way for you to learn. i.e., if the person says the card didn't fit or there wasn't enough room to plug in my VGA cable, then that card might not be the correct card for you. Selecting your RAM. Sometimes our customer will want to upgrade to use a particular application, and that application will require more RAM. Or if they're doing a lot of computing and the computer is freezing up and they get frequent error messages, then it might be important for them to do a RAM upgrade. So you're going to need to make sure of the RAM compatibility. What kind of RAM does a motherboard take? What is the speed of the RAM? If it's an older computer, this RAM could be expensive. In some cases, it will point you towards doing a whole computer upgrade. Adapter cards. These tend to be the most frequent upgrades that people do. You will do these upgrades not because your computer is failed some way, but because you or your customer would like to expand the capacity or capabilities of your computer. And we have different types of cards and we have different types of slots. And computers can vary by the number of expansion slots and the types that they have. So it could be a PCI slot, it could be a PCI Express slot. We might want to upgrade with a wireless NIC card or a NIC card or a video adapter card. If a motherboard does not have the capability to expand via slots, then sometimes we can expand using our USB or FireWire ports, and this is a great way to do it if they have open ports. So hard drives and floppy drives, some things to take in consideration. Also to take in consideration, you don't want to have your computer fail or have your customer's computer fail when you heard certain things indicating that the computer might be failing soon. So if you're hearing unusual noises from the hard drive, you're getting error messages, or the data is starting to get corrupted, it might be time to replace the hard drive. I know floppy drives are here. You should understand floppy drives for the test. We don't always work on floppy drives. They don't hold a lot of data. If a customer has an XP system, you might need to use the floppy drive sometimes to do certain things, but in most cases you won't need the floppy drive. So what are some replacement options? You could do a traditional magnetic disk drive with a solid state drive, optical drives. There could be external storage. And again, it means floppy drive. We see limited usage there. I've already mentioned that. Another way, we can do external storage with USB also. How about types of hard drive connectors? So there's PATA, SATA, and SCSI. So PATA is parallel ATA hard drives. And they were originally called ATA, Advanced Technology Attachment. And then when they introduced SATA, they changed the name to PATA. And they can be 40 or 80 pin conductor cables. And so obviously that can vary the speed on the number of pins. Then we have SATA, which is more advanced. It connects to the motherboard using a serial interface. It has a higher data transfer rate than PATA. It's a key thing you want to remember. And they're smaller data cables, so they allow for greater airflow. And then we also have SATA for external usage, and that's called eSATA for external SATA. And you'll see over on the right here, we have some pictures of SATA, PATA, SCSI, and eSATA. Then we have our SCSI, which is Small Computer System Interface for hard drives. It uses a 50-pin, 68-pin, or an 80-pin connector. And there with a SCSI interface, you can connect 15 SCSI drives together to a SCSI controller. And then so you can do better data storage. You can also do mirroring and have redundancy. So usually an individual, a home user wouldn't do something like this, but a small business might want some kind of SCSI drive interface. With a lot of companies going to cloud-based storage, this might not be something that you will encounter that often. And so here we have some examples of the Small Computer System Interface, and it's usually used for hard drives and tape storage. It needs to be terminated, so it's usually ideal for high-end computers, including network servers that require high transfer speeds and reliability. The SCSI devices are connected in a series, forming a chain that is called a daisy chain. So remember what a daisy chain is. Remember, at each end of the daisy chain, it must be terminated. And under a SCSI environment, each device must have a unique SCSI ID. So here are some examples of different types of SCSI. You will want to look at this chart. This is in your reading, so become familiar with it and the different types of SCSI. what they're called, the different connectors, and the maximum throughput that you can have. So obviously the Ultimate 320, your answer is kind of there. If you had to know what was the maximum throughput, it's 320 megabytes. Remember, a big B is for bytes and a small b is for bits. Then we have solid state drives. And solid state drives use static RAM instead of magnetic platters to store data. And there are a couple advantages for this. They are going to be quieter and they're going to use less power. They're more reliable because they have no moving parts, so that means they're not going to fail as frequently. But there are some things that are considered, that you need to consider when selecting. The costs, they tend to be a little bit more in expense-wise. They're not as new as they used to be, and a lot of computers are now using them, so the price is coming down. They can be external or external. You'll need to consider the case locations, the power requirements, and the speed and the capacity of these. So they're usually going to take up less space, so you'll usually find them in advanced laptops today. So again, in your reading, you have a flash presentation that shows you different types of these. It also goes into look at the common types of media cards, the SD, micro SD, compact flash, and memory sticks. So, and these SSDs, which is the abbreviation name, are considered highly reliable because they have no moving parts. So here's an example of some of the media reader types, which I had just mentioned. And again, these were expensive when they were first introduced. Now they're coming down in price. It's a great way to transport data. They're in the smartphones today. They're in MP3 players. They're in cameras. So it's a relatively inexpensive and great way to share data and transport data. Optical drives. Our optical drives can be CD-ROMs, DVD-ROMs, or Blu-ray players. And a CD-ROM is a drive that can only read CDs. A CD-RW can read and write CDs. A DVD-ROM is a drive that can only read DVDs and CDs. A DVD-RW can read and write to DVDs and CDs. DVDs are for video and they have higher storage capacity. Most computers today are coming with DVD readers and writers in them today. And then the new technology, because it is high definition, is Blu-ray readers, and they can read Blu-ray discs, DVDs, and CDs. A Blu-ray writer can read and write to Blu-ray discs and DVDs also. So, and it holds significantly more data than a DVD player. For some of our customers, especially for small businesses, we might need to consider external storage, and that external storage can connect either via USB, FireWire, which is the IEEE 1394 SCSI, or eSATA. When we're looking at external storage, we're looking at whether it is portable, its storage capacity, the speed, power requirements, and the port types. Sometimes, depending on the port type, we might need external power. If it's USB or IEEE 1394 FireWire, then usually we do not need an additional power source. Input and output devices. So far we've talked about some devices, but now we're going to look at our input and output devices and the type of cabling that they use. So you'll see here we have FireWire, which is IEEE 1394, and it can transfer data at 100, 200, and 400 megabits per second. Remember, the small b is bits. And then we have IEEE 1394B, which transfers at 800 megabits per second, so much faster. One of the things to remember about FireWire, when they say it's 100 or 200 and so forth, that's what you're actually getting. Sometimes with the other rates there can be fluctuation. For the parallel, which is IEEE 1284, it transfers data at a maximum speed of 3 megabytes per second. And then serial, which is R232, and the earlier versions were limited to 20 kilobits per second, but newer versions can reach 1.5 megabits per second. SCSI, or an Ultra SCSI 320, connects as many as 15 devices with a transfer rate of 320 megabytes per second, and USB interface is widespread and used with many different devices. USB 1.1, USB 2, and USB 3. The different versions can transfer data at higher rates. And then we have SATA, which is the interface that is replacing IDE and EIDE as the standard interface for hard drives. The eSATA, the external SATA connection, can be hot swappable. Also remember that USB and FireWire are hot swappable. You want to know the designation number and then the common name. So i.e. USB, you want to know its common name, like FireWire and the IEEE 1394. Okay, so this will be the end of the topic for today's lesson. In the next lesson, we'll cover configurations of specialized computer systems, such as home theater systems, virtualization, and some other systems like CAD and video processing. All right, have a great day. See you next time.